Hey guys. In my last video, I explained how liberalism led us to where we are right now. But it's not the whole story. There's no way this system could have kept itself going if it was only about a bad understanding of human nature. As I explained in my video on women in the online right, young women are the biggest single component in the liberal left, while far-right parties are overwhelmingly male. So why does liberalism appeal so strongly to women? Is it just because of their self-interest? Or is there something deeper in female psychology at play here? I've been doing a bit of research, and I was a bit hasty when I claimed that human nature in general was centered around group identity and friend-enemy distinctions. The male warrior hypothesis expands on social identity theory, indicating that men are hardwired for group-based competition in a way that women are not. Because one man can father many children with many women, while women are limited in their reproduction, male fitness hinges on competing for access to women. Naturally, groups of men will be much better at this than single men, which is why the male-dominated tribe is the historic standard for humans, and this manifests in the data. Outgroup men trigger defensive responses, while outgroup women do not. Men also become more cooperative within their own group when faced with external threats, something that we don't see with women. This supports the idea that nationalism and ethnocentrism are male reproductive strategies. Translated into politics, this means that groups of men define the friend-enemy distinction between each other, while women coexist in these male-defined groups without being able to define groups themselves. When German women were given the right to vote in 1918, they actually voted mostly for the conservative parties that opposed enfranchising them in the first place. This trend continued right up until fairly recently. You also see this in many other countries, where women historically voted for conservative or moderate parties more than men. This isn't behavior you'd expect if women were acting as a separate political unit, like I had indicated in my previous videos. So I have to take the L here. But around the 1980s, across the Western world, we saw women shift politically to the left. Why is that? I already talked about the prisoner's dilemma, but feminism was not properly addressed, despite it being very important as a value-shifting movement. 1970s radical feminism was ironically rather male-brained, because it was confrontational and it made a friend-enemy distinction between women and men. And this limited its popularity among most women, interestingly enough. Liberal feminism dropped all this systemic critiques of patriarchy and focused instead on individual rights and legal equality. By the 1980s, it had largely replaced radical feminism, and by the 1990s, sex-positive feminism grew out of liberal feminism, reframing the sexual revolution from a negative under the radfems to a positive thing for women's freedoms. This mirrored the collapse in church attendance over the same time period, as women's conservatism mostly came from their religiosity. You can view the trajectory of radical feminism to liberal and sex-positive feminism as starting out with these types of women, and then getting hijacked by normies who realized how much better liberal feminism was for them than the radical sex-hating bra-burning stuff. And because liberal feminism focused on individual freedoms and attacking male-imposed boundaries rather than the structural critiques of patriarchy, it was a much better fit for female psychology. And now lib-feminism is so normalized that many functionally lib-fem women see radical pink-haired SJWs as the actual feminists and themselves as moderates. This shift from conservatism to feminism was just female ethics asserting themselves over male-defined religious values as women became more independent. This is because women's moral sense evolved to be more contextual and relational, unlike men's tendency towards moral absolutism. Take a situation like adultery. A typical man would oppose it on principle, but a typical woman would oppose it based on the harm it does to the betrayed party. Is the same moral judgment, but based on different logic. If it turns out that the context of the cheating was more sympathetic to the cheater, for example, if they were being abused or neglected, the woman's judgment may shift, whereas the man's judgment will still be focused on the principle. Women don't see moral absolutes the way men do, and find the abstract justifications men use for imposing boundaries on them unconvincing. and this is a pattern that emerges time and time again between the sexes. The absolutism of male psychology translates into clearly defined rules, borders, and boundaries, whereas relational female psychology tries to blend away these distinctions and transform hard rules into soft guidelines. Philosophical liberalism fits female psychology because they both center on individuals connected through relationships, rather than cohesive friend-enemy groups. Men see outgroup males as sexual and economic rivals and potential threats, but women don't interpret things that way. Sharp boundaries between the in-group and out-groups are jarring for the female psyche, especially when there are vulnerable people on the other side, like women or children. The irregular immigration issue perfectly highlights this divide. Irregular immigrants who grew up in America and sound like Americans are getting arrested and deported by ICE, and this is a red meat for triggering feminine outrage. By contrast, men understand that immigration laws need to be strictly enforced, including the hard cases, because otherwise your country just doesn't have borders. The media frames hostile male reactions to issues like this as victimization of vulnerable minorities, triggering the female instinct towards harm avoidance, driving them to condemn their own men as racist. When these same immigrant men victimize women, we see the opposite rationalizations from them, for the same reasons. For women, loyalty to abstractions like their nation or race, in opposition to the moral consensus, doesn't make sense unless they have a direct emotional stake in its future, which is why married women and mothers are more right-wing than single women. Consider the case of Japan. If the Japanese had maintained their empire, would the situation for Japanese women be better in any meaningful way than it is now? With Japan's loss, their borders were opened up to foreign men, and they were given the legal independence to pursue those men. An imperial Japanese victory would really only benefit Japanese men, giving them access to women from colonized lands. And Vietnam is an even sharper example. Did Vietnamese women win with the fall of Saigon? Their country went into a long period of economic and political isolation that only recently started thawing. The Vietnamese victory was a victory for Vietnamese men who had reimposed their monopoly on their women through controlling the borders. Women who had mixed-race children with foreign men, especially US soldiers, were excluded from Vietnamese society. And to this day, Vietnam is one of the most socially conservative countries in Southeast Asia, where women's reputations are extremely important. On the other side of this, we see women quickly realign themselves when their original group loses to another group. For example, the conquistadors in Latin America didn't just force themselves on the local women. In many cases, the women actually sought them out because they were higher status than the indigenous men in this new colonial system. As a result, Latin American paternal lineages are overwhelmingly European, even in countries with lower European ancestry like Peru. The Ukraine war is another brutal example of this. As soon as the shots were fired, young women took off as refugees, while their men stayed and died by the hundreds of thousands in the trenches. They don't feel like they've left the group behind because there is no us or them outside of their friends and family. Direct emotional connections. Feminists see patriarchy as controlling women's reproductive freedoms for the male group's interests. I actually agree with them here, except I would argue these men protect them from other men and the state of nature, and therefore they're justified in imposing barriers for the sake of the group's survival. And to prove I'm not just a misogynist, here's a steelman. When contained in the male-defined group, women are actually great for softening social divides. For example, the Women's Christian Temperance Union became one of the largest women's organizations in 19th century US. These women pushed for eliminating prostitution, reducing alcoholism, and banning child labor, all good things in a traditional Christian society. The problems begin when these groups of men are from immutably different backgrounds, where shared culture and language will never be able to bridge those gaps. In those cases, you need boundaries between these groups in order to have harmony, and this is where female nature increases conflict, even with good intentions. So, I'm amending my prediction about mayonats and feminism. They'll try to appeal to the feminists, but it won't actually work because they have to cuck out and become civnats in order to win women over. We've already seen this in the far-right parties that went mainstream, like the RN in France or AfD in Germany. On top of the ethics being innately unappealing to women, nationalism is like putting a tariff on outgroup men. They'll refuse to pay it, and you can't force them to. It doesn't matter if your group's men are more attractive than others on average. Increasing the number of men competing for women pushes down all men's expectations, and there will always be attractive outlier men of all backgrounds that women will want access to. It's important to note here that none of us are benefiting from this. Our countries are being transformed, and the immigrants themselves are being atomized, with their women joining ours in politics after a generation or two. We even see westernization spreading back to their home countries through cultural transmission. And a lot of our guys have been forecasting that the liberal state will eventually implode due to men checking out, or the immigrant population displacing the leftists through natural growth. This fantasy of collapse is appealing because even if we lose in the end, at least they go down with us. Even the most pessimistic mayonats believe this thing will destroy itself when it runs out of productive men. But what if it doesn't? A true nightmare scenario could unfold, where oligarchs like Elon Musk and Bezos not only control the means of production, but production itself, and we become excess men in every sense of the word. The message I was trying to get across in my previous video on liberalism is that we need to start thinking like a vulnerable group instead of temporarily embarrassed world rulers. This means treating other groups of men pragmatically, even the ones we have conflicts with, and prioritizing threats properly. Don't expect women to be of any help here either. The ideal for women is to be in an open-ended, permeable caste hierarchy, where they can mate up the status ladder, not unlike how Latin America works today. This is America's current trajectory. For Mayo-Nats, it will mean modification. For the vast majority of immigrants, it will mean being locked into the bottom 90% of the socio-economic caste system, and the government and society will be shaped around benefiting the top 10% of men. Besides, many of our guys wonder how certain powerful minorities achieved what they did over the past century. A key factor was their ability to form coalitions with other minority groups to achieve common goals. It's something to consider because we're on a timeline. Once automation and AI is perfected, these pissing contests become meaningless and we all end up in the maid pods. And that's all. Like and subscribe if you liked the video. If not, let me know why in the comments. If any of you want to support me and my work, my links are in the description. I greatly appreciate everyone who's already donated. It helps a lot in this country. And until next time, guys, talk to you later.